and good afternoon to everybody who's joining us. My name's Stuart Moore, and I'm joined today by my colleague, as ever, Daniel Chapman Marlowe. And today's webinar topic is the £100,000 hiring mistake. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll just run through a little bit of housekeeping. So for those of you who've not joined our webinars before, we generally work to a 30-minute timescale. And unfortunately, that means that we won't have time during the webinar for Q&A. But usually we get a few minutes at the end if anybody's got any questions they'd like to ask, and we'll enable the microphones. During the webinar, feel free to use the chat, and I will just very briefly hand over to Dan now, who's going to tell you a little bit about that.
Thanks, Stuart. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. If you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat box. I'll put the first comment up in there just so you know where to put the comments. As Stuart rightly said, we'll try and leave a bit of time at the end just to go over some of the questions if I'm not able to answer them going through the webinar, and so we'll have a bit of Q&A at the end. But yeah, looking forward to delivering this for you guys today.
Thanks, Dan. And also just to let everybody know, we are recording the webinar. What we tend to do is post the content on our social media channels afterwards. Don't worry, we're very good at anonymizing these, so none of your names or I would say faces, but everyone's cameras are off at the moment. But yeah, it will be anonymized, so please don't be concerned. Right, okay, so without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so what we're talking about today is the cost, or rather the negative impact on a bad hire. And before we go too much further, I'd like to just do a very, very quick poll of the room. So please put your electronic hand up if you have in the last couple of years made what you would call a bad hire. So I'm just going to give you guys 10 seconds or so to drop. Yeah, we've got one or two hands coming up. Okay, fine. And I'm sure that there will be lots of reasons why that happened. We're going to run through some of the most common reasons that we find companies make bad hires, and not to do ourselves a disservice, that's not necessarily through ourselves. Businesses hire people in all shapes and forms all over the place, but what we're going to try and do today is to give you 5 clear top tips on how to avoid making a bad hire, but also talk about some of the other wider repercussions that a bad hire can have in the business, and where we came up with the £100,000 statement from. Which I appreciate was a good headline, but yeah, we're going to try and back that up a little bit. So first of all, where is this come from then? So CIPD estimates the true cost of a bad hire to be between 1.5 and 3 times the person's annual salary. So quite simply, UK's average salary is about 37,000. That would make the cost, as you can see, just over 100,000. And just to sort of break that down a little bit more, that's really down to the following. So if you think about it, you've got the £37,000 of the salary itself. You've got, assuming this person is not performing in the role, you've got, general poor performance and the wider impact that can have on the business in terms of, deadlines, and so forth. You've got the cost of inducting the person, you've got the ongoing cost of training the person, you've got the negative impact that somebody leaving the team can have on morale. And what you tend to find is, even if the person hasn't made a spectacular impact on the business, they will have made some personal connections within the team that they're working in. So any turnover of staff can have potentially a negative impact on the wider team, which could potentially even destabilize 1 or 2 members of that team and lead to further resignations in the department, and thus replacing those people and re-recruiting. Recruitment costs, of course, advertising or agency costs, again, you're doubling up, but also, especially if the role is customer facing, there is the real danger that somebody may have formed a good connection with one of your clients who, shortly after the person leaves, you might find that the orders with that client start to dry up. So again, there's all of these kind of knock-on effect that a bad hire could have within the business. Just to throw a few numbers on that, because I could sense one or two people thinking, well, that still doesn't, how does that add up to 100 grand? Here are some basic calculations. So CIPD estimate that an average cost to hire in the UK is just over £6,000. Now, appreciate that if you aren't working with an agency partner, that might be slightly reduced at point of hire. However, if you have an internal talent team, and let's say that person's earning or costing the business around 50k, and they're hiring 20 people a year, that works out to around about £5,000 per hire for each person that person brings in. So it's not a huge difference to a sort of small to medium sized business using agency. You've got the wages there, so we're calculating it based on roughly 6 months of wages plus national insurance and all the other, pension contributions and so on. You've got an average training and onboarding cost of 3k, general cost of lack of productivity of around 20,000, and then you've got the various other costs here. So you can see over 6 months, which is what this is based upon, you're looking at a cost of about 61,000, which again, if we're looking at our person averaging a salary of 37, that's already within 6 months 150% of the cost of their annual salary. So again, scale that up to a full year, and well, I'm not going to do some quick maths now, but that's a lot of money. Okay, so hopefully we've made the point relatively clear. So why does this happen? Again, I mentioned at the very beginning, we work with all manner of businesses, corporates, SMEs, startups, and these are the main things that we see as to what can lead to a bad hire. Number one there, rushing the recruitment process. We tend to find that, in some instances, a company will need somebody straight away. The pain point is the department is stretched, it's understaffed. We just need a bum on a seat. And, as long as the person appears to be able to kind of do the job, maybe, sometimes that'll do. Job descriptions, if the description, or let's say the potential role doesn't really line up with the actual role, once the person gets in the door, of course, then you're at risk of churn in that respect too. So we'll talk a little bit more about all of these points as we go through the session. Over reliance on CVs, again, there's more ways to judge a candidate than just based on the CV alone. And the good old-fashioned gut feel hire, which still happens a lot today. They'll be sat in front of a hiring manager, and the person will just click. And we all know candidates sometimes can put on a game face for an interview and do really well, but often sometimes the reality once they're in situ can be very different. So these are the kind of ones that we tend to see more and more in these instances. So how do we prevent mistakes? Well, as I said, we're going to go through these in a little bit more of a breakdown. So talking a bit more about job descriptions, again, we get all manner of job descriptions sent through. These can range from very well crafted JDs that clearly have been mapped out according to the needs of the business. Sometimes we get what is obviously something that's just been pulled off of Google. Very, very easy. If you're looking for a job description on pretty much any role, you can find it on the internet if you look for it. And second to that is we need a job description for this role. We'll just bosh something together on ChatGPT. Again, starting to see that a little bit more in recent months. So again, if the JD hasn't been put together with the needs of the business in mind, it can be quite different to the actual job once the person's in situ. We'll talk a bit more about how to build a structured and timely interview and assessment process that actually allows for objective assessment of candidates. We'll talk a little bit about scorecards in a moment, if that's not something that you're used to using. We'll talk a little bit about how agencies can help if you are partnering with a recruitment firm, but also, when was the last time you took up references? I would be honest now and say, I can't believe just how many businesses don't take up references. And again, we'll come on to those shortly. So step one, job descriptions. When was the last time your job descriptions were drafted? And I would say that if there have been any significant changes within the organization over maybe the past year or two, then it will be well worth revisiting the job description, especially where there's been a structural change or reorganization in the business, or maybe something like a IT system implementation, because often those systems or processes will change, and what may have been in the job description a year ago is no longer there because the system perhaps does it for you. I know a lot of companies right now are looking at automations. I'm not just talking about AI, I'm just generally talking about efficiencies where software can cut out some of the kind of admin tasks. So maybe the role is a little bit different now to maybe what it looked like 2-3 years ago. The other thing that's quite important too is the line manager. Quite often, sometimes in the recruitment process, and if you are a recruiter and you do a lot of recruitment as part of your job, you'll often see that sometimes the hiring manager will have a different take on the role than what the job description says. Again, was the current manager of that team involved in putting the job description together, or was it something they inherited, perhaps from a previous manager, or maybe it was put together by somebody else in the business? So again, what we can find sometimes when hiring is there'll be a kind of a disconnect between what the organization thinks that the business needs, and sometimes this is funneled through HR, and what the actual manager understands the need for the business is. And when those don't quite join up, you can get hiring mistakes, or even, and we do find this, the line manager will be looking for a certain criteria of candidates, but that might not have been relayed in the advert or the instruction to the agency because we're going off of an old job description or an old brief. So we always ask to have a dialogue with the line manager, and that tries to sort of mitigate some of those issues. It's like, okay, here's the job description, but tell me in your own words what you're looking for from your team. But again, that's not always possible, especially when you're dealing with larger corporates where you're using an ATS system or there's a in-house recruitment team. So again, if it has been any changes, it's well worth revisiting and redrafting and updating those job descriptions. So yeah, so hopefully that helps a little bit with the JDs. Now the interview process, I would say in most cases where there's been a hiring mistake, certainly in some areas where we've been involved, is sometimes a company will offer a candidate after just one interview. Okay, and that might be because, as I said earlier, there's an immediate need and there's that pressure to get somebody in, or it could be a good old gut feel hire. And whilst ultimately we act under your instruction, we would always advise that you'd bring the person back in for a follow-up interview. There's a couple of reasons why that's important. So first of all, after a first interview, you will need some time to process your thoughts about the candidate and sometimes even just sleep on it. Maybe you might feel slightly different tomorrow to how you felt straight after the interview. Secondly, and this is really important, the candidate has to process it as well. And this is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they were possibly a little nervous in the first interview, especially if they're not used to a lot of interviews. And maybe they went away or thought of a few questions, which perhaps they hadn't had an opportunity to ask in the first interview. Secondly, it's often the second interview where any cracks or doubts might come in. And this is because in a second interview, you can sit back a little bit more and be a bit more objective, maybe bring in another person into the interview to get a second opinion. It's a bit, if you think about it, it's like buying a house. You wouldn't necessarily go and put an offer in for a house after just one viewing, because it's sometimes the second viewing of a house where you notice the little damp patch that you didn't notice the first time, or the cracks in the ceiling, or the fact that there's about 20 cars parked outside the property that wasn't there 2 days ago. So again, it's that old saying, measure twice, cut once. And even just doing that could potentially save you from making an impulsive or bad hire. So we would always recommend, I know there's sometimes a couple of forces pulling at themselves for this process, because you'll get a lot of noise from recruiters saying, don't hang around. If you see a good candidate, grab them, get them off the market, make an offer straight away. That is still valid to a point, but you're not going to lose a candidate by sleeping on it for 24 hours. Certainly you won't if they're interested. If they're going to come to you for an interview and then the very next day accept a job somewhere else, then I would say perhaps they weren't actually that interested in what you had to offer. So again, maybe you've saved yourself, a kind of an impulsive job acceptance. And again, sometimes this can then impact later down the line when people drop out of an interview process or drop out of a job offer, or just even sometimes fail to turn up. So there are lots of things that can come off the back of that. Try to book your second interviews. Try and keep your interview process relatively condensed though. So as I've said here, try not to do things or not spread it out too much. If you do find candidates you really like, try and get them back in for a second interview within around about a week of seeing them. Again, because they're naturally going to be attending other interviews. But really this is about controlling the process and trying to make sure that one or two stakeholders in your business have had a view of that candidate, so you can compare notes, but equally you're still seeing them in a relatively short time scale, so you're hopefully not losing out on the good candidates that you really want to hire. And off the back of that, I mentioned scorecards at the beginning. So for those of you that not used a scorecard before, this is a very, very simple way of creating a objective level playing field between candidates. So let's say you've got 4 or 5 people coming in for the same role, and therefore you need to build a scorecard. So here's a sort of a picture example of what I'm talking about. So what you need to do is think about a basic scoring system, or how you and the other person interviewing would judge. So presumably 1 would be terrible, 10 would be absolute, knocked it out of the park. And then based upon the job competencies and any technical skills, create about, as you can see here, about 10 different areas of criteria that you're going to score that candidate on based upon the answers they give you. So you're going to create an interview script where you're going to ask the same questions to the different candidates and then score them accordingly. Now, I would suggest that isn't just, can you do this? Can you do that? Have you done this before? I would also throw in a couple of competency-based questions, so let's say, for example, the role involves some problem solving. Could be a question such as, okay, well, give me an example of where you have had to deal with this type of problem. How did you do it? And then you could score them firstly on the detail of the answer, but secondly, on the quality of the answer. So whether you feel that they really answered the question and also gave you the sorts of responses that you thought, yeah, actually that would work. That would fit in our organization. Hopefully that makes sense. We do go into details on, just I would say this, we also run other webinars on interviewing skills for employers as well. So if you are interested in that, let me know, because we'll be doing that again in the very near future, where we go into all of this a little bit more detail. The other things as well that are worth considering is some basics. So where does the person live? You know, what is their salary budget? So does that fit with our budget? And again, score it out of 10. And of course, do they have the relevant qualifications for the role? So if it requires a professional qualification, do they have that? Are they working towards that? In which case they might score a little less, but they may still score reasonably well because there's obviously potential and they're showing a bit of, what's the word? They're showing a bit of initiative in completing that assessment. So again, create this for the role. What's super important though, is you run exactly the same process with each candidate to create a fair assessment process. This will reduce the impulsive hires, and also, you know, you might have a gut feel about someone, but what do the facts say? And that's really important. Here's a little one here if you do partner with external recruiters. So one of the things that, or one of the key benefits from working with a recruiter is you shouldn't need to do any of the initial outreach, applicant vetting and assessment of candidates at all. Ultimately, that's what you're paying us to do, okay? So if we come to you with we've taken a full brief, we've gone away, had a look out on the market, spoken to a number of people, be they right or wrong, we would have had many conversations with people about this position that we're recruiting for. Off the back of that, we will get a very clear sense as to which of the candidates that we're putting forward to you are the most suitable based on everything you've told us, but not just also based on the job description, but about all of the other bits of information that you've given us in conversation, okay? So quite often, we might come back to you and say, okay, we think this candidate will be great for the role, okay? And usually we'll sort of put a bit of a profile and a bit of information about that. I'll be honest with you now, there is lots of instances whereby a company will look at the CV, they'll have a look at what the agency's written, and their first thought might be, oh, they're just not right, or the agency hasn't read the brief, or oh, I'm disappointed because it's not quite what I'm looking for. Now that may be true, but I would bet that there would be a very good reason why that recruiter felt that you should see the job, see the person. And just in our business alone, I could give you half a dozen examples within just the last few months of where a client has said to us, no, they're not quite right, or I don't think they're as strong as the other candidates, so I'm probably not going to see them. And I've literally said this, just do speak to them, okay? If you aren't happy, by all means, shout at me, okay? I'm willing to put my head on the block on this one. Just have a conversation and see if you can see what I'm seeing. And in all of those cases, bar none, the client has either ended up hiring the person or they have been a front runner candidate in the process. In fact, I could even give you a couple of testimonials whereby the client has said, actually, I wouldn't have seen that person had it not been for your intervention. So I'm not going to labor on the point, but ultimately, if you are working with an agency partner, especially where you're using an ATS, where sometimes the agent doesn't have direct comms with the hiring manager, if the recruiter says they're worth seeing, maybe it's worth you giving them 10-15 minutes of your time. If they're wrong, fine, shout at the recruiter, blacklist them, maybe don't listen to them next time, but there will be a good reason and it might be worth you picking up a call. Finally, and this is a big one, so again, a little poll again for everybody, please show your hands. Who in the room always takes up references with their candidates when they're making job offers? So I'll give you a few seconds just to put your hands up or pop something in the chat. I'm really interested to know because many employers I speak to will say, do you know what? No, we didn't take up references, or references aren't worth the paper they're written on because, you know, we're lucky if we get dates, or they don't really tell you anything. And yes, okay, that is true. A lot of the time you will perhaps only get a factual reference. But when we're looking at objectivity and we're looking at facts, if you've got a candidate that says they were in this role with this company for 3 years, and the reference comes back and the dates add up and the job title is confirmed, at least you know that is true. And again, I could bore you silly with the amount of times I've taken up references on candidates and the dates have been completely different from what they've put on their CV or their LinkedIn profile. And I've had to go back to the person and say, can you just clarify your dates of employment again? Oh, yeah. Oh God, is that a typo on my CV? Yeah, it's about a year out. So you're going to tell me what you did in that year that you've not put on your CV? Ah, well, etc., etc. So if you're not referencing, quite a lot of hands up actually on that one. If you're not referencing, please reference. Please, please, please do it, because it will save you potentially so much grief. It really will. And if you look back on some of your bad hires, were they referenced? Were they things that came out later on once you've hired them? In other words, they just weren't competent at the job. They couldn't do what they said they could do. And sometimes you get a little bit of water cooler chatter as well, and you'll hear little skeletons after they've gone, and you're frustrated going, why didn't you tell me this? Why didn't you tell me this when they were still here? Again, this is an admin process that's so often overlooked. And I would always get a reference for the most recent job, okay? Even if they were only there a short period of time. And try and go back about 2 years on the person's CV. So we often do it, we always do that when we're placing, for example, temps or contractors for a client. We'll always reference for 2 years. And if the references don't cut it, they don't work on our payroll. If there are any skeletons, this is where they'll come out. And on the extra little bit of extension on that is always in your offer letters, write, this offer is conditional to receipt of satisfactory references. Okay, that's really important. You put that line in your offer letters, because if the reference is not right, then you are fully able to go back and withdraw that job offer on the basis of unsatisfactory references, and you're not going to be exposing yourself to any sort of unwanted claim for whatever. You're completely safe. Okay, so thank you for participating in that. That was really interesting. Because again, going back to the speed of hire, I've just made the final point in there. Do give yourself a little bit of time to collect those references before the person starts. It's a really hard conversation to have with someone that's been in a job for 2 weeks and is making a good start and making colleagues and friends when you've had potentially a piece of information back from a previous employer that contradicts what they told you in an interview. That's really, really awkward. So often it might be a case of just pushing the start date back a week or so, just to give yourself a little bit of time to get that information back. Okay. So we are rapidly approaching 30 minutes. It goes incredibly quickly. Hopefully those 5-step process will help to some degree and save you an awful lot of cash in the process, which everybody wants to do right now. And but of course, you know, we do this for a living. So if there's anything in here that perhaps you'd like a little bit more detail on, or maybe, you know, you'd like us to take a look at some of your processes, more than happy to do that. Ultimately, that's what we're here to do. So next time, what have we got for you? October, we are going to be partnered again by the lovely Judy and Susie of Muse HR. They are going to give us a very up-to-date whistle-stop tour of the Employment Rights Bill. So hopefully all of you have heard of this. This is the new piece of legislation being going through Parliament at the moment. So some of the aspects of the bill are due to come into force before Christmas. So this is very, very timely. So we'll be sending out information about that in the next couple of weeks. That's Wednesday, the 15th of October at 2 o'clock again. So hopefully you'll be joining us for that. Right, we've got a couple of moments if anyone's got time to go to questions. So I am going to enable the microphones, and if anybody would like to ask a question, then they are more than welcome. So give me a moment and I will allow the microphones. Okay, so there we go. So yeah, does anybody have a question? Dan, if you're happy to manage this, that'd be great.
Will do. I'll see if we get anything comes in the chat, if anyone puts their hands up or anything.
I think there's a couple of people with their hands up by looks of things.
That was still overlap from the questions that you were doing during the webinar.
Oh, fair enough. Looks like Karis might have her hand up still. Karis, did you have a question?
No, I didn't. Sorry, that's from earlier. I do apologise. But that was really interesting. Thank you.
Fair enough. Okay, any questions at all, guys, before we wrap up? Okay, stunned silence. All right, well, like I said, we'll be popping this on our social channels tomorrow, so I'll send you the links if you'd like to look at that. But thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully you found some of that useful. And hopefully we'll see you for next month's webinar about the Employment Rights Bill. So have a good rest of your day and goodbye.